Good Saturday morning, everyone, and welcome into today's daily Bible reading. Today is June the 10th, and we're reading together in Joshua chapter 5. Joshua chapter 5. Thanks so much for taking some time on this Saturday morning to read along with me in the Bible as we're making our way from Genesis through Esther for this year, reading together the historical portions of the Old Testament. I hope that's been a blessing to you thus far, and hope that today's reading will be a blessing as well. Let me go ahead and get the text of Joshua 10 up on the screen for us, and we'll read along together today. Here, Joshua chapter 10, verse number 1. Joshua 10, verse number 1, when all the Amorite kings across the Jordan to the west and all the Canaanite kings near the sea heard how Yahweh had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over, they lost heart, and their courage failed because of the Israelites. And at that time, Yahweh said to Joshua, "Make flint knives and circumcise the Israelite men again." So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelite men at Gibeath Haaraloth. This is the reason Joshua circumcised them. All the people who came out of Egypt, who were males, all the men of war, had died in the wilderness along the way until they had come out of Egypt. Though all the people who had came out were circumcised, none of the people born in the wilderness along the way were circumcised after they had come out of Egypt. For the Israelites wandered in the wilderness 40 years until all the nation's men of war who had come out of Egypt had died off because they did not obey Yahweh. So Yahweh vowed never to let them see the land he had sworn their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. He raised up their sons in their place. It was these Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised since they had not been circumcised along the way. After the entire nation had been circumcised, they stayed where they were in the camp until they recovered. Yahweh then said to Joshua, "Today I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt from you." Therefore, that place is still called Gilgal today. While the Israelites camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month. The day after the Passover, they ate unleavened bread and roasted grain from the produce of the land. And the day after they ate from the produce of the land, and the day after they ate from the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Since there was no more manna for the Israelites, they ate from the crops of the land of Canaan that year. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied. "I have now come as the commander of Yahweh's army." Then Joshua bowed with his face to the ground in homage and asked him, "What does my Lord want to say to his servants?" The commander of Yahweh's army said to Joshua, "Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did that. And that is Joshua chapter 5. Following the last couple of chapters where we saw the Israelites having to exemplify their faith before Yahweh and being willing to cross the sea, we see this incredible event of, or not across the sea, across the river Jordan on dry ground. We see this incredible event of the sea being stopped by Yahweh as the priests entered into the water with the Ark of the Covenant. We see this event not only having an impact on the people, this being a sign to them of Yahweh's power and Yahweh's faithfulness. This verse 24 gives us what took place, not only for them, but this is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that Yahweh's hand is mighty, and so that you may always fear Yahweh your God. So not only for them was this great event taking place, but also for the nations. And in fact, the very next thing we read in chapter 5 is that the nations took note. The Amorite kings, the Canaanite kings, they all heard about what Yahweh had done, and the exact same thing that had already happened in Jericho happened among these individuals as well. They lost heart, and the courage failed because of the Israelites. So we're thinking right here in this moment, it is time to attack. It's time to push forward, full steam ahead, put on even more steam. We can just barrel over everyone right now. Except that's not what Yahweh does. Instead, he does the absolute honestly, if we're thinking just from a militarily strategic point of view, the worst thing possible. He incapacitates his fighting force. And he does so through having Joshua circumcise all the men of Israel. The way this is explained to us is that those who came out of Egypt were circumcised. They had kept this sign of the covenant while they were in Egypt. Yet those that were born after Egypt in the wilderness, the text tells us they were not circumcised, which should not be surprising to us because that was a very unfaithful generation. The responsibility of circumcision fell on the parents, and if the parents themselves were not faithful, then it should not surprise us that the children were not entered into the covenant through the sign of circumcision. Therefore, this needed to take place. That's why it was so important. It was so important for Yahweh to incapacitate his nation's fighting force for a time. Who knows how long it took them, but we do know that this being done to men does completely incapacitate you. Go back to Genesis chapter 34 with what took place with Levi and Simeon and the Shechemites, I believe it was, after there was that unfortunate circumstances surrounding their sister Dinah and one of the men of Shechem, where they went in and feigned entering into a covenant with them through circumcision, and they struck them all down while they were incapacitated. We see that happens with this, especially at that time, without the modern technological things happen today. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how long it will take a man today, to recover from such a procedure. But surely during that time, it was no small feat. So while they were in this place, they recovered. And that in and of itself would have been a really strong act of faith on the part of the Israelites, that Yahweh was going to protect them and preserve them while their fighting force was incapacitated. And that certainly was the case. But in doing so, Yahweh tells Joshua in verse number 9 that today I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt from you. Therefore, the place is called Gilgal, because Gilgal means rolled away. Well, what is the disgrace of Egypt? I think there's a couple options here. One could be just the idea of slavery, that you are absolutely free from slavery because now you are in covenant with me in an absolute way because you have entered into the covenant of circumcision. But it could also be the disgrace of Egypt being just the idea of rebellion, that the rebellious unfaithfulness of your parents and the fact that they did not circumcise you as they should have, that has been rolled away. I think either one of those work. I specifically think the slavery idea works, considering the very next thing that's mentioned in the text is them observing the Passover, which was them being freed from slavery. It was the final act of God in Egypt that allowed them to be freed from Egypt. It was the last strong show of force in Egypt that allowed, or that really just humbled Pharaoh, really broke him and broke his spirit for the people to be able to leave. They observe the Passover here. Maybe this is about the third observance of the Passover. We see it in Exodus 12 for sure. Maybe Numbers 9, we see an observance of the Passover. And then here in Joshua 5, we see another time. So that should have been observed every year, but it's not recorded that it was. Now, just because it's not recorded that was, doesn't mean that it wasn't. But this is, I believe, the third observance that's recorded for us of the Passover. And what's interesting about this Passover is the fact that they ate the manna that had been dropped down all along the way in the wilderness. But it tells us here that the day after they ate from the produce of the land, the manna ceased, because with this Passover, they ate what they had, the resources they had, they took from the land of Canaan itself. Remember, this land flowing with milk and honey, that had vineyards they did not plant, had crops they did not plant, they'd be able to feast and gather resources from these things that God had blessed them with. They were able to do that now, and therefore the manna ceases, because there's no longer a need for the manna, because the land itself would produce produce, would give them produce, would provide, there we go, that's a good word there, would provide produce for them by which they could be sustained and live. Again, this is just God continuing to provide for the people, albeit in a different way at this point. So God has provided for them in getting them over the river by stopping the water, allowing them to walk through on dry ground. He has provided for them in allowing them and showing patience by allowing them to enter into the covenant with them. With circumcision, he protected them all while the army was incapacitated. And then he also provided for them for their resources through what was taken from the lands. Now, verse 13 finishes this up, and maybe verse 13 through 13, 14, 15 would fit better with chapter 6, since chapter 6 gets into more of the military actions of Jericho. But nonetheless, we find it here in chapter 5, and it tells us that Joshua was near Jericho, and he looked up, and he saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approaches this man. It just seems to be a man, at least best we can tell from Joshua's perspective. And Joshua asks him a question: are you for us, or are you for our enemies? But the answer is very interesting. He says, neither. I'm not for you, and I'm not for your enemies. Instead, I am the commander of Yahweh's army. Joshua, in response to this, very interesting that Joshua's response is to fall down and worship this figure. Was he falling down to worship a man? I don't think that's the case at all. And I say that based on what we continue to see in this discussion, this conversation. Well, Joshua worships him and says, well, what does my Lord want to say to his servant? And the commander of the Lord's army says to Joshua, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you're standing is holy. Why? I believe this echoes what took place in the burning bush account, in that Yahweh's presence was here. This was most certainly, I believe, a theophany, meaning a manifestation and appearance of God. But I really want to say, I believe that this is a prefigure of Christ. That most of the time, whenever you see language of the angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, the angel of Yahweh, I think that is a manifestation of Christ before his full incarnation on this earth. I tend to believe that that's what's going on here within this text. That is the identity of this individual here. Again, why is the place holy? Why must Joshua take off his feet? Well, it's because this is a holy being that is before him. This is a supernatural being, and not just any supernatural being, but I believe the pre-incarnate Christ. That's just my view on the text. I know that could be agreed with or disagreed with, but it just seems to me that anytime we see almost every time, I think the one time that I would not think it being Christ, Jesus himself, the Son, who is coming in form, would be like in I think it's Genesis 18. I want to say it's Genesis 18. It could be Genesis 15. Whenever Moses is under the tree, and the three men come and meet with Moses. Let's see who it is. Let's see. Genesis 18 with the three figures. I'm not sure if I would specifically say this is Jesus in this point, or in this event in Genesis 18, or if I would say it was more manifestation of the Father, you would say. But it's one of them for sure. But here, more specifically, I think this would be probably the pre-incarnate Jesus. But again, that's open for debate for sure. Nonetheless, this is someone that Joshua recognizes being someone worthy of reverence. Therefore, he worships him, and then he's told to remove his feet because this was holy ground, and Moses and Joshua certainly did that thing. Just another example where Joshua is going through something very similar to what Moses went through. Again, just continuing to reaffirm in the reader's minds the reality of Joshua's position and the importance that he's going to play in this story moving forward in this book that bears his name. One thing I will mention about this text, it goes back to what we see with the first generation in the wilderness. It reminds me a lot of 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, that the first generation experienced a number of things that should have helped to instill faith within them. Here, it's mentioned that they were circumcised. They had been entered into the covenant with Yahweh, but they'd also seen the plagues. They had seen the Red Sea be parted. They had drunk from the water, which the text there says was Christ. They provided for in every way, and yet they were still unfaithful. It is very possible, unfortunately, for people who have seen and experienced the goodness of God to still reject God and to still not live according to faith in him. Let me encourage us all today to not forsake and to not neglect the good things that God has done for us, and to despise him by rejecting him and rejecting his will for us in our lives. Don't be like that first generation, but be like the second one that we've seen up until this point. Be faithful, trust, and submit yourself to God. I appreciate so much you tuning in for this reading on this Saturday. Hope you'll do so again tomorrow as we read in Joshua chapter 6, which is going to be the conquest of Jericho, probably one of the stories that we're decently well familiar with, especially if you've grown up in the pews. Probably remember marching around Jericho. We'll read about that tomorrow and talk about that some then. Again, have a great rest of your Saturday, everyone. Thanks so much for tuning in today. We'll see you tomorrow. Take care and God bless.